There are thoughts so impossible, so unsettling, that the human mind instinctively tries to escape them, not because they are false, but because they feel too true. Tonight, you will step into ideas that sound unreal at first, yet become harder to ignore the longer you sit with them. Thoughts that quietly exist beneath everyday life, beneath memory, beneath identity, beneath the feeling that you are a stable person moving through a stable world. Because what if your mind is not showing you reality, but protecting you from it? What if every certainty you have ever trusted exists only because your brain cannot survive without simplifying the infinite? And what if the voice you call yourself is only the final echo of processes you never chose? These are not ordinary paradoxes. These are impossible thoughts that feel true. So tonight, let the noise fade, let the world become distant, and allow your mind to wander into places it was never designed to fully understand. Mind that cannot prove reality is real. Every experience you have ever had shares one terrifying characteristic. It happened entirely inside your mind. The room around you, the screen in front of you, the feeling of your body resting where it is now, all of it arrives as electrical interpretation, signals translated into color, sound, texture, and meaning by a brain locked inside darkness. You have never touched reality directly. You have only touched your mind's version of it. And at first, this sounds obvious, almost harmless. Of course the brain interprets information. Of course perception is subjective. Everyone knows that. But the deeper you follow the thought, the stranger it becomes. Because if every experience is filtered through the mind, then what evidence could ever prove the outside world truly exists beyond perception? Think about dreams for a moment. While dreaming, impossible things feel completely normal. Entire worlds appear around you instantly. Streets, oceans, conversations, memories. In dreams, you rarely stop and say, "This cannot be real." The dream feels real because your brain generates the experience of reality itself. Only after waking do you recognize the illusion. But here is the impossible thought. How do you know this moment is different? People often answer quickly. They say reality is stable, predictable, consistent, but dreams can feel stable too while they are happening. Some dreams contain entire lifetimes compressed into minutes. Some create emotional experiences more powerful than waking life itself, and the mind accepts them completely. So what exactly separates reality from an experience that merely feels real? The frightening answer is that you may never know with absolute certainty. Philosophers have wrestled with this for thousands of years. René Descartes famously questioned whether an evil force could deceive him into believing in a false reality. Modern thinkers transformed the idea into simulations, artificial realities, or consciousness trapped inside systems it cannot perceive. But beneath every version lies the same unbearable problem. A mind cannot step outside itself to verify the world producing it. You cannot compare reality against a more real version of reality. Every attempt at proof still depends on perception, thought, memory, and awareness, the very things being questioned. Even science, humanity's greatest tool for understanding existence, ultimately depends on observation interpreted by conscious minds. And yet, despite this uncertainty, you continue living as if the world is unquestionably real. Why? Because the brain values functionality more than certainty. Imagine trying to survive while doubting every sound, every object, every person around you. The mind cannot function efficiently under constant existential uncertainty. So it builds stability, it creates confidence, it generates the feeling that reality is solid and external, not necessarily because it can prove it, but because survival requires belief. This changes how you see certainty itself. Most people think confidence means truth, but often confidence is simply what allows the mind to operate without collapsing into endless questioning. Your brain does not need perfect accuracy, it needs coherence, and coherence can exist even inside illusion. That realization becomes even stranger when you examine perception more closely. Take color, for example. You think you see the world directly, but color does not exist out there in the way it feels. Objects are not inherently red or blue or green, they simply reflect wavelengths of light. Your brain converts those wavelengths into subjective experiences called color. The redness of red exists inside consciousness. The same is true for sound. The universe itself is silent. Vibrations move through matter, and the brain transforms them into the experience of noise. Even time feels stable only because consciousness arranges experience into sequence. In other words, the world you experience is not raw reality. It is a constructed model, a useful hallucination refined by evolution. And suddenly, a disturbing possibility appears. If your mind already constructs reality from incomplete information, then how much of your everyday world is interpretation rather than truth? Neuroscience reveals that perception is heavily predictive. Your brain constantly guesses what reality should look like before fully processing sensory input. It fills gaps automatically. It edits information. It simplifies overwhelming complexity into manageable experience. You are not passively seeing reality. You are actively generating it. Most of the time, this process works so smoothly you never notice it, but occasionally the illusion cracks. Optical illusions expose hidden assumptions in perception. False memories reveal how easily the mind rewrites the past. Hallucinations demonstrate that the brain can produce convincing realities without external input at all. And then comes the question that lingers quietly beneath everything. If the mind can fabricate reality so convincingly, how would you ever know when it already has? At first, this thought creates discomfort. But if you stay with it longer, something deeper begins to emerge. Perhaps certainty was never the goal. Perhaps existence is not about proving reality beyond doubt, but participating in experience despite uncertainty. After all, even if reality were somehow simulated, imagined, or fundamentally different from what it appears to be, your emotions still feel real. Your suffering still matters. Your connections still shape consciousness. Meaning still emerges within experience itself. A dream can still affect the dreamer, and maybe that is enough. Still, there remains something haunting about the fact that no matter how intelligent humanity becomes, no matter how advanced science grows, consciousness may always remain trapped behind its own perspective. a mind searching for proof, using tools created by the very thing it doubts, like an eye trying to see itself completely without reflection. And maybe this is why certain moments feel so strange late at night, moments when the world suddenly feels unfamiliar, when existence itself becomes difficult to explain, when you briefly sense the fragile miracle of awareness suspended inside endless uncertainty. In those moments, reality stops feeling obvious. It starts feeling impossible. Yet somehow, here you are, listening, thinking, questioning, existing inside a universe your mind cannot fully prove is real, while being unable to escape the experience of it. And perhaps that is the final paradox. You may never achieve certainty about reality, but uncertainty itself is undeniably real to you. The doubt exists, the awareness exists, the experience exists, and maybe that thin thread of conscious experience, fragile, mysterious, impossible to fully explain, is the closest thing to truth the mind will ever hold. Choice that happens before you decide. Most people believe they understand what a choice feels like. You think about two possibilities. You weigh them carefully. Then, at some clear moment, you decide. It feels direct, personal, intentional. It feels like proof that you are in control. But hidden beneath that familiar feeling is one of the most disturbing discoveries ever revealed about the human mind. Your brain may decide before you ever become aware of the decision. And if that is true, then what exactly is the self doing? Imagine reaching for a glass of water. The movement feels voluntary, conscious. You believe you decided to move your hand, and then the action followed naturally afterward. But experiments in neuroscience uncovered something deeply unsettling. Before a person becomes consciously aware of making a decision, measurable brain activity already begins preparing for the action. Signals appear seconds before the person reports the feeling of having chosen. The brain moves first, awareness arrives later. At first, this sounds impossible. Surely the experiments must be flawed. Surely consciousness still controls the process somewhere. But the deeper you examine it, the stranger it becomes. Because even in ordinary life, thoughts often appear before you intentionally create them. You do not choose the next idea that enters your mind. You simply notice it arriving. Try it now. Predict your next thought before it appears. You cannot. The thought emerges automatically, and only afterward does consciousness become aware of it. This creates an unsettling possibility. What if the feeling of control is not the source of decisions, but the story told after decisions already begin? The mind hates this idea because identity depends heavily on authorship. People want to believe they are directing their lives from a central point of conscious control. But what if consciousness is less like a commander and more like a narrator trying to explain events already unfolding? That would mean your sense of agency, the feeling that I decided this, could partly be an illusion created after unconscious systems complete most of the work. And suddenly, ordinary life starts looking very different. Why did you become the person you are? Why do certain songs move you emotionally while others do nothing? Why are you attracted to particular people, fears, ambitions, or beliefs? Most of these processes begin far beneath conscious awareness. Genetics, childhood experiences, emotional conditioning, hormones, memory, environment, and unconscious pattern recognition constantly shape your behavior before conscious thought even enters the picture. By the time awareness notices a desire, the machinery creating that desire may already have been operating for years, and yet consciousness still feels central. That is the paradox. The experience of choosing feels undeniably real. When standing between two paths, you genuinely feel uncertainty. You feel possibility. You feel responsible. But if every thought, emotion, and impulse arises from prior causes outside your direct control, then where exactly does free will begin? Some philosophers argue it never does. According to strict determinism, every event in the universe, including human thought, is the inevitable result of previous conditions. Every choice you make was always going to happen exactly as it did, shaped by chains of cause and effect stretching backward long before your birth. Under this view, the universe behaves like falling dominoes, complex dominoes, emotional dominoes, self-aware dominoes, but still dominoes. And if that idea feels uncomfortable, it is because your identity depends on the belief that you could have done otherwise. Without that belief, concepts like guilt, pride, regret, and personal achievement begin to blur. Could you truly have chosen differently in any moment if your brain, history, biology, and environment were identical? Or was the outcome always inevitable? The mind resists this thought because it threatens the foundation of individuality itself. But then another strange possibility appears. What if free will and determinism are not opposites? What if the self is simply part of the causal chain? After all, your thoughts still influence the future. Your decisions still matter within reality, even if those decisions arise from prior causes. A river follows physical laws, yet still shapes landscapes. Maybe consciousness is similar, not separate from causality, but an expression of it. Still, something unsettling remains. If your brain initiates actions before conscious awareness notices them, then awareness may not be leading experience the way it feels. It may be arriving slightly behind reality at all times, a delayed observer inside its own life. This could explain why some actions feel automatic before you fully understand them, why emotional reactions happen instantly, why words sometimes leave your mouth before you consciously organize them. The conscious self may not be the creator of thought, it may be the witness of thought. And perhaps that is why silence can feel so strange. When external distractions disappear, you begin noticing how little control you actually have over the mind's activity. Thoughts appear without permission, memories surface unexpectedly, emotions shift on their own. The mind behaves more like weather than machinery, and the self stands inside it, trying to claim ownership afterward. But here is where the paradox deepens even further. If consciousness does not fully control thoughts, then what exactly are you? Are you the thoughts themselves, the awareness observing them, the system generating them, or merely the story connecting them together? No answer feels complete, and maybe that is because the self was never a single thing to begin with. Modern neuroscience increasingly suggests that identity is not controlled by one unified center. The brain contains countless competing systems interacting constantly beneath awareness. Emotion, logic, instinct, memory, fear, habit, and prediction all shape behavior simultaneously. The feeling of being one stable self may emerge from these systems working together smoothly enough to create continuity, like many voices blending into one song. But if that is true, then the person you experience as you may be less solid than it seems, more process than entity, more movement than object. And suddenly, the impossible thought begins to feel true. Perhaps you are not the author of consciousness standing outside the system. Perhaps you are consciousness happening inside the system, not separate from causality, not separate from biology, but part of reality unfolding moment by moment. This does not necessarily make life meaningless. In some strange way, it may make existence more miraculous, because awareness still exists, experience still exists. Love, fear, grief, wonder, all of it still flows through consciousness regardless of where decisions originate. The river may follow invisible laws, yet the river is still real. And perhaps freedom was never about escaping causality entirely. Perhaps freedom is simply the experience of participating in reality from within. Still, late at night, when the world becomes quiet enough, the question returns: did you truly choose your life? Or did your life slowly choose you, one unconscious moment at a time? While awareness arrived afterward to call it me, memory that changes every time you recall it. Most people imagine memory as a kind of storage, a place where the past is carefully preserved, like photographs sealed inside the mind, untouched by time, waiting to be reopened exactly as they happened. But memory does not work that way. And once you realize what memory truly is, your entire relationship with the past begins to feel unstable. Because every time you remember something, you change it. Not metaphorically, literally. The moment a memory returns to consciousness, it becomes vulnerable again, flexible, editable, open to distortion before being stored once more. In other words, remembering is not replaying the past, it is rebuilding it again and again and again. At first, this seems impossible. Surely the important moments of your life remain fixed. Surely childhood memories, painful experiences, major decisions, and emotional turning points exist somewhere inside you exactly as they occurred. But neuroscience reveals something deeply unsettling. Human memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. The brain does not store perfect recordings. Instead, it stores fragments, sensations, emotions, meanings, details, patterns, and then reconstructs experiences each time they are recalled, like a storyteller rebuilding a scene from scattered pieces. And with every reconstruction, small changes can occur. Details shift, emotions intensify or weaken. Certain moments become clearer while others disappear completely. Over time, the memory slowly transforms, not because you are intentionally lying to yourself, but because the mind prioritizes coherence over accuracy. This explains something strange about human beings. Two people can experience the exact same event, yet remember entirely different realities afterward. not because one is necessarily dishonest, but because memory is shaped by emotion, attention, expectation, fear, identity, and meaning. The brain does not preserve objective reality perfectly. It preserves the version that fits the internal narrative of the self, and suddenly, a terrifying question appears. If your memories constantly change, then how much of your identity is built on unstable ground? Think about who you believe you are. Almost all of it depends on memory. Your personality, your relationships, your regrets, your fears, your dreams. Without memory, continuity disappears. The self begins dissolving into disconnected moments. Memory creates the feeling that there is a stable you stretching across time. But what happens if memory itself is fluid? Then identity may be fluid too. This becomes especially disturbing when you realize how easily false memories can form. Psychological experiments have shown that people can develop vivid memories of events that never actually happened. Entire scenes can be implanted through suggestion. Over time, the brain fills missing details automatically until the false memory feels emotionally authentic. And emotion is important here, because the mind often measures truth by feeling rather than accuracy. If something feels real enough, the brain accepts it. That means certainty itself becomes unreliable. You may confidently remember conversations that never occurred exactly that way. You may carry guilt for distorted versions of events. You may define yourself by stories partially rewritten through years of emotional reconstruction. The past inside your mind is not frozen. It is alive, changing quietly every time you revisit it. And perhaps you have already noticed this without realizing it. Certain childhood memories feel dreamlike now. Some painful experiences seem softer than before. Others grow heavier with time. A moment that once felt insignificant suddenly becomes meaningful years later. The event does not change, but your relationship to it does. And because memory is reconstructed through the present self, the current version of you continuously edits the past version of you. It is almost as if the mind rewrites history to maintain psychological continuity, to preserve the story. Because humans do not simply remember events, humans remember meaning. That is why emotionally intense memories often survive longer than ordinary ones. Fear, love, shame, grief, wonder. These emotions act like gravity inside consciousness, pulling certain experiences deeper into identity. But even emotional memories are not safe from distortion. In fact, emotion often increases distortion. The more powerful the feeling, the more the brain may reshape details around it, and suddenly the impossible thought begins to feel true. Maybe your past is not a fixed timeline behind you. Maybe it is a living narrative continuously rewritten by the present moment. This changes the way regret feels. People often suffer because they believe the past exists as something permanent and unreachable. But psychologically, the past evolves every time it is remembered. The emotional meaning attached to events can transform completely across years. A painful memory can become wisdom. A joyful memory can become grief. An ordinary moment can later feel sacred. In this strange way, memory bends time itself. The past does not stay where it was. It moves with you. But there is another layer to this paradox that feels even more unsettling. Sometimes the mind changes memories for protection. Traumatic experiences may become fragmented or blurred. Certain details disappear entirely. Others become exaggerated. The brain edits reality not always to deceive you, but to help you survive emotionally. Truth is not always psychologically sustainable, so the mind softens it, reshapes it, hides parts of it behind silence, and this creates a strange tension inside human existence. You want your memories to be accurate because accuracy feels connected to truth, but sometimes survival depends on selective distortion. The brain walks constantly between reality and emotional stability, between truth and functionality, and perhaps that is why nostalgia feels so haunting. Nostalgia is not merely remembering the past, it is remembering the emotional atmosphere surrounding the past, the warmth, the longing, the unfinished feeling. Often, people are not nostalgic for events themselves. They are nostalgic for who they were while living those events. But that person no longer exists exactly as they once did, because memory changed them, time changed them, experience changed them, and so nostalgia becomes a kind of impossible mourning, a longing for a reality reconstructed partly from imagination, a place emotionally real, yet forever unreachable. Still, despite all this uncertainty, memory remains one of the most beautiful abilities consciousness possesses, because even imperfect memories allow meaning to survive. They allow love to echo beyond moments. They allow human beings to carry pieces of each other through time. Even distorted memories contain emotional truth. Even fragile recollections shape identity, and maybe perfect accuracy was never the purpose of memory. Maybe memory exists not to preserve reality exactly, but to preserve emotional continuity inside a constantly changing self. Still, late at night, when certain memories suddenly return without warning, the feeling can become deeply unsettling. Because for a brief moment, you realize you are remembering a version of reality filtered through countless previous versions of yourself. A memory, remembering a memory, remembering a memory, until eventually the line between truth and reconstruction becomes impossible to fully separate. And somewhere inside that endless reconstruction, the self continues building its story, one altered memory at a time, silence that exists beneath every thought. Most people are afraid of silence, not ordinary silence, not the absence of sound, but the deeper silence that appears when the mind briefly stops speaking. Because in those rare moments, something strange begins to happen. You notice that thoughts are not constant. They rise, they disappear, and between them there is something else, a silent space that was already there before the thought arrived. At first, this sounds simple, almost meaningless. Of course, thoughts have gaps between them, but very few people ever truly pay attention to those gaps. The human mind is addicted to movement, thought after thought, memory after memory, fear after fear. The internal voice continues so constantly that most people mistake it for themselves. But here is the impossible thought. What if the voice in your head is not what you are? What if it is only activity appearing inside something much quieter? Try to observe your thoughts carefully. Not control them, just watch. You will notice something unsettling almost immediately. You do not create thoughts in the way you assume. They simply appear. A memory arrives, a sentence forms, an image flashes across awareness, and only afterward does the mind claim ownership by saying, "I thought that." But before the thought appeared, what existed? Silence. And after the thought disappears, what remains? Silence again. This changes everything, because if thoughts come and go, yet awareness remains, then awareness may be deeper than thought itself. Most people spend their entire lives trapped on the surface of the mind, believing the constant internal narration is their true identity. They become emotionally controlled by every passing thought, because they never question the source of the voice speaking inside them. But thoughts are strangely impersonal. You cannot predict your next thought completely. You cannot stop every unwanted thought from appearing. You cannot fully explain where thoughts come from before they enter consciousness. The mind behaves less like a machine under control and more like weather moving across open space, clouds forming and dissolving endlessly, and beneath all of it, silence remains untouched. This becomes especially noticeable late at night, moments when the world grows still enough that your inner voice becomes louder than everything around you. At first, the silence feels uncomfortable. The mind rushes to fill it immediately. Music, scrolling, conversation, noise, anything to avoid facing the strange emptiness underneath thought. Because silence reveals something terrifying to the ego. Without constant mental activity, the familiar sense of self begins weakening. Identity depends heavily on continuous narration. I am this kind of person. This is my story. These are my fears. These are my goals. The mind repeats these narratives endlessly to maintain psychological continuity. But when thoughts temporarily fade, the structure holding identity together becomes less solid. And for a brief moment, consciousness feels open, undefined, boundaryless. Some people experience this during meditation. Others encounter it unexpectedly during grief, exhaustion, nature, or deep emotional moments. There are rare seconds when thinking pauses naturally and awareness remains by itself without explanation. Those moments often feel strangely peaceful, but also deeply unsettling, because the self suddenly feels less permanent than before. This may explain why many spiritual traditions throughout history became obsessed with silence. Not because silence itself was magical, but because silence exposes the difference between awareness and thought. Thought is movement. Awareness is the space allowing movement to appear. And the strange part is this: the silence beneath thought is never actually absent. You simply stop noticing it when the mind becomes noisy, like stars hidden by daylight. Even now, while reading these words, silence exists underneath every sentence. Thoughts arise within it and disappear back into it continuously. The mind is like waves. Silence is like the ocean beneath them. But modern life trains people to fear stillness. Constant stimulation keeps attention trapped on the surface level of consciousness. Endless distraction prevents people from noticing the deeper quiet underneath mental activity. Because once you notice it, ordinary reality begins feeling different. You realize that thoughts are temporary events, not permanent truths. Fear becomes less absolute, anxiety becomes less convincing. Even emotional pain changes shape slightly when observed from beneath the constant stream of thinking. This does not mean suffering disappears, but the relationship to suffering changes. A thought saying, "everything is wrong," no longer feels identical to reality itself. It becomes something appearing inside awareness, then fading away again. And perhaps this is why silence feels so powerful. Silence does not argue with thought. It survives thought. Every fear eventually dissolves back into it. Every memory disappears into it. Every identity returns to it. Even language itself emerges from silence temporarily before vanishing again. In this way, silence may be more fundamental than thought, more permanent than identity, more stable than emotion. And suddenly another impossible question appears. If silence exists beneath every thought, then why do humans spend their entire lives running from it? Maybe because silence threatens the illusion of control. As long as the mind keeps speaking constantly, the self feels active and solid, but silence reveals how fragile mental identity actually is. The voice in your head is not continuous because you control it perfectly. It is continuous because the brain fears emptiness. The ego survives through movement, through narration, through endless mental noise. And yet, ironically, people often feel most alive during moments when thought temporarily disappears. Watching the ocean, falling deeply in love, standing beneath stars, hearing music that completely absorbs the mind. During these moments, the internal voice briefly quiets, and reality suddenly feels immediate again. Direct, unfiltered, almost sacred, as if silence allows existence to reveal itself more clearly than thought ever could. Still, the mind quickly returns. The narration restarts. The identity rebuilds itself. Because functioning in the human world requires thought. Language, planning, memory, and survival all depend on it. The goal is not to destroy thinking. The goal is simply to recognize that thinking is not the entirety of what you are. There is something deeper, quietly present beneath it all. Something that existed before today's first thought appeared. Something that remains after the final thought fades at night. And maybe this is the strangest part of all. The silence you spend your entire life searching for externally may already exist inside every moment of consciousness itself, hidden beneath every fear, every desire, every memory, every word, waiting patiently underneath the noise where it has always been. Identity built from borrowed ideas. Most people believe their personality belongs entirely to them. Their opinions feel personal. Their beliefs feel chosen. Their preferences feel authentic. It feels as though somewhere inside the mind there exists a solid, original self. Someone independent, unique, and internally created. But the deeper you examine identity, the stranger it becomes. Because almost everything you call yourself came from somewhere else first. Your language was borrowed, your beliefs were influenced, your fears were inherited, your ambitions were shaped by people you did not choose. Even the way you understand reality was quietly constructed by culture, family, memory, media, education, and countless invisible forces surrounding you since childhood. And once you truly see this, individuality begins to feel less stable than before. Think about something simple: your favorite music. Why do certain sounds move you emotionally while others do not? At first, it feels like pure personal taste, but your taste emerged from experiences, environments, exposure, emotional associations, and social influence accumulated over years. The same is true for humor, morality, politics, beauty, success, love. Even the image of the person you want to become was shaped partly by observing others. The human mind absorbs reality constantly, often without awareness. Childhood especially leaves deep invisible fingerprints on identity. Words spoken casually by parents, teachers, friends, strangers, even fleeting moments of praise or rejection can shape personality for decades afterward. And the frightening part is this: most of these influences entered your mind before you were capable of consciously choosing them. In other words, the self forms long before the self fully exists. This creates a deeply unsettling paradox. If your identity was shaped by external forces you did not control, then how much of you is truly yours? At first, the mind resists this question strongly. People need to feel original, independent, self-created. The ego depends heavily on the belief that identity emerges from some central inner core, untouched by outside influence. But reality appears far more interconnected than that. Humans imitate constantly, not just behavior, entire emotional structures. You unconsciously adopt speech patterns from people around you. You mirror body language automatically. You absorb values from groups you belong to. Even moods spread socially between minds without conscious permission. The self behaves almost like a sponge, pretending it created the water inside it. And perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in modern life. People spend enormous amounts of time surrounded by invisible psychological influence. Social media, advertising, entertainment, ideology, and digital culture continuously shape perception beneath awareness. Entire desires can be manufactured externally and later experienced internally as personal truth. You suddenly want something, a lifestyle, an appearance, a belief, and it feels like your own idea. But often the seed was planted long before you noticed it growing. The mind rarely sees the origins of itself clearly, and this becomes even stranger when you realize identity changes depending on environment. You are not exactly the same person with friends as you are with family. Different emotions emerge around different people. Different versions of the self activate automatically depending on context. This means personality may not be singular at all. It may be adaptive, fluid, relational, a constantly shifting response to surrounding reality. Yet despite all this instability, consciousness still experiences itself as one continuous me. Why? Perhaps because the brain creates narrative unity from scattered psychological pieces. It gathers memories, habits, beliefs, and emotional patterns into one coherent story called identity. Not because the self is perfectly stable, but because the mind requires continuity to function. The story keeps consciousness organized, but stories can change. And that realization becomes terrifying when major beliefs collapse. Sometimes a person encounters new experiences that completely rewrite who they thought they were. A loss, a betrayal, a discovery, a relationship, a tragedy. Suddenly the old identity no longer fits reality, and the mind enters crisis. Not because facts changed, but because the self built from those facts begins dissolving. This explains why humans defend beliefs so emotionally. Challenges to worldview often feel like attacks on identity itself, because beliefs are not separate from the self-story. They are part of the architecture holding the mind together. Remove enough borrowed ideas, and the familiar version of you starts disappearing. But here is where the paradox deepens. If identity is partly constructed from borrowed ideas, does that make it fake? Not necessarily. After all, language is borrowed too, yet conversations are still real. Music uses shared notes, yet songs remain meaningful. Human beings are deeply interconnected creatures by nature. Perhaps individuality does not come from existing independently of influence. Perhaps it emerges from the unique way influences combine within consciousness. No two minds absorb reality in exactly the same way. Even identical experiences create different emotional meanings in different people. The self may be shaped externally, but the pattern itself remains uniquely lived. Still, there is something unsettling about realizing how much of your inner world was inherited unconsciously. Certain insecurities may not truly belong to you. Certain goals may have been handed to you by society. Certain fears may echo generations older than yourself. And perhaps some parts of your identity survive only because they have been repeated long enough to feel natural. The mind mistakes familiarity for truth constantly. This is why silence and isolation can feel transformative. When external influence temporarily weakens, people sometimes begin noticing which desires genuinely matter to them and which ones were absorbed automatically from others. But complete separation from influence is impossible. Humans are relational beings. Consciousness develops through interaction. Without other minds, identity itself would barely form. You learnt your name from others. You learnt meaning from others. You learned how to see yourself through the eyes of others. In many ways, the self is partly social reflection, a mirror built from countless mirrors. And maybe that is why loneliness feels so painful. Without external recognition, identity begins feeling unstable. Human beings unconsciously rely on one another to maintain the reality of the self. People need witnesses to their existence, not merely physically, psychologically, emotionally. The self becomes clearer through relationship, but late at night, when all external voices become quiet, another question sometimes appears. If so much of your identity was shaped by borrowed ideas, then who would you have been otherwise? The mind searches desperately for some untouched original self hidden beneath conditioning, some pure identity that existed before influence, but perhaps no such version ever existed. Perhaps humans were never meant to become isolated selves created independently from the world. Perhaps consciousness itself is collaborative, a vast exchange of memory, language, emotion, culture, and meaning passing endlessly between minds across generations. And maybe the most impossible thought of all is that the person you call you is not a fixed entity separate from humanity, but humanity expressing itself temporarily through one unique perspective. A perspective built partly from countless borrowed pieces, yet somehow still unmistakably alive. Fear that creates the danger it escapes. Fear is supposed to protect you. That is its purpose. Long before human beings built cities, wrote philosophies, or questioned existence itself, fear kept fragile bodies alive in a dangerous world. It sharpened attention, accelerated reaction, forced survival to become the highest priority. Without fear, humanity would not exist. And yet, something strange happened as consciousness evolved. Fear stopped protecting reality alone. It began shaping reality too. Because the human mind does not simply react to danger, it anticipates danger, imagines danger, creates entire futures filled with danger before anything has actually happened. And sometimes, the fear itself becomes the very thing causing suffering. At first, this seems obvious. Everyone knows anxiety can become irrational. But the deeper you examine fear, the stranger it becomes. Because fear changes behavior in ways that quietly create the outcomes it tries to avoid. Imagine someone terrified of rejection. They overanalyze every interaction. They become emotionally guarded. They hesitate to speak honestly. They withdraw slightly to avoid vulnerability. And eventually, relationships weaken. Not because rejection was inevitable, but because fear reshaped behavior until distance slowly became real. The mind predicted danger, then unconsciously constructed it. This pattern appears everywhere in human life. Fear of failure creates paralysis. Fear of embarrassment creates awkwardness. Fear of loneliness pushes people away. Fear of losing control generates chaos internally. The more desperately the mind tries escaping certain emotional outcomes, the more powerfully it often moves toward them, like struggling in deep water and sinking faster because of panic itself. And perhaps nowhere is this paradox more disturbing than in anxiety. Anxiety is not fear of the present moment, it is fear of imagined futures. The body reacts to possibilities as though they already exist. Heart rate changes, muscles tighten, thoughts spiral endlessly around scenarios that have not happened and may never happen. The nervous system cannot fully distinguish between vividly imagined danger and immediate physical threat, so the mind suffers inside realities it created itself. This means human beings possess a terrifying ability, the power to experience pain generated almost entirely through anticipation, and anticipation changes perception dramatically. Once fear enters the mind, reality begins reorganizing around it. Attention narrows automatically toward threats. Neutral events start appearing suspicious. Small uncertainties become catastrophic possibilities. Fear acts like a lens distorting the world. The more intensely you fear something, the more visible evidence of it seems to appear everywhere. Not always because reality changed, but because attention changed. And attention shapes experience more than people realize. Imagine walking alone at night after hearing disturbing news about crime. Ordinary sounds suddenly feel threatening. Shadows seem alive. Every movement captures attention immediately. The environment itself may not actually be more dangerous than before, but fear transformed perception. The mind started searching aggressively for confirmation of danger. This survival mechanism once protected early humans effectively. Missing real danger was costly. False alarms were safer than ignoring predators. So evolution shaped the brain to prioritize threat detection heavily. But modern consciousness carries this ancient system into psychological realities where imagined dangers can become endless. Social fear, existential fear, fear of failure, fear of meaninglessness, fear of not being enough. Unlike physical threats, these fears often cannot be resolved completely because they exist partly inside interpretation itself, and so the mind enters loops. Thought feeding emotion, emotion feeding thought, fear creating behavior that reinforces fear again, until eventually people begin organizing entire lives around avoidance. Avoiding conversations, avoiding intimacy, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding silence, avoiding themselves. And here the paradox deepens even further. The more the mind avoids fear, the larger fear often becomes. Because avoidance teaches the brain that the feared thing must truly be dangerous. Every act of escape reinforces the belief internally. Temporary relief strengthens long-term fear. This is why phobias grow stronger through avoidance. The mind never receives evidence that survival was possible without escape, and suddenly an impossible thought begins feeling true. Perhaps fear survives not because danger is always present, but because the mind continuously protects fear itself. The ego becomes strangely attached to fear patterns. Familiar fears create predictable identity structures. Anxiety may feel painful, yet strangely safe compared to uncertainty without it. Some people fear failure so intensely they never fully attempt their dreams. This protects them from possible disappointment, but also guarantees unrealized potential. Fear prevents pain temporarily by creating a different kind of pain permanently. And perhaps that is why human beings often remain trapped in emotional patterns they consciously hate, because fear values survival over happiness. The nervous system does not ask whether you are fulfilled, it asks whether you are safe. Even if safety means shrinking your life smaller and smaller over time, still, fear is not evil. Fear is ancient intelligence trying to protect vulnerable consciousness from suffering. The problem is not fear itself, the problem is identification with fear. People begin believing every fearful thought automatically. This will go wrong. I cannot handle this. Something terrible is coming. The mind treats predictions as reality long before reality arrives. But fearful thoughts are not prophecy. They are possibilities amplified by survival systems. And the strangest part is this: many of the most meaningful human experiences require moving directly through fear rather than escaping it. Love requires vulnerability. Growth requires uncertainty. Truth requires discomfort. Freedom requires stepping beyond psychological safety. The things that make life feel most alive often exist precisely where fear says not to go. And perhaps this explains why courage feels so powerful. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is action despite fear, a refusal to allow imagined futures to completely control present reality. Because eventually, every human being confronts the same realization. No amount of fear can fully protect you from pain. Loss will still happen. Change will still happen. Death will still happen. Control will always remain incomplete. And once the mind truly understands this, something unexpected can occur. Fear loosens slightly, not because danger disappears, but because endless resistance becomes exhausting. The person stops trying to control every possible future, stops negotiating constantly with uncertainty, stops organizing existence entirely around avoidance. And in that surrender, life begins opening again. Still fragile, still unpredictable, but more real. Because fear had quietly become a wall separating consciousness from direct experience. Late at night, this paradox becomes deeply visible. You realize how many moments of suffering came not from reality itself, but from anticipation of reality. How many beautiful experiences were delayed by imagined danger. How many versions of life remained unlived because fear convinced the mind survival mattered more than existence itself. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: the danger fear tries hardest to escape may sometimes be the life waiting beyond fear itself. Thought that pretends to be you. There is a voice inside your mind that has been speaking for as long as you can remember. It comments on everything. It judges, explains, worries, predicts, remembers. And because the voice is always there, most people eventually begin believing the voice is who they are. But here is the impossible thought. What if the voice in your head is not actually you at all? What if it is only another thought, pretending to be the self? At first, this sounds absurd. Of course, the inner voice feels personal. It speaks using the word I. It narrates your life continuously. It feels intimate and familiar. But if you observe carefully, something strange begins to appear. You can hear the voice, you can notice it speaking, which means there must already be some form of awareness separate enough to observe it. After all, a thought cannot observe itself. Something else must be present. And the deeper you watch the mind, the stranger the voice becomes, because it never truly stays consistent. Sometimes it is kind, sometimes cruel, sometimes confident, sometimes terrified. It changes personality depending on emotion, exhaustion, memory, fear, or environment. Yet despite these changes, the mind keeps insisting, "This is me." But how can something constantly changing be your permanent identity? The voice behaves more like weather than selfhood. Thoughts arrive automatically, often without permission. Entire arguments appear internally without conscious creation. Random memories interrupt silence unexpectedly. Songs repeat endlessly in the background of awareness. The mind keeps producing content continuously and then attaching ownership afterward. And perhaps this is why human beings suffer so deeply from thinking, because they believe every thought personally. A fearful thought says, "You will fail," and instantly the body reacts emotionally. Another thought whispers, "You are not enough," and consciousness contracts around it. The mind speaks constantly, and the self obeys automatically. But what if thoughts are not commands? What if they are merely mental events passing through awareness, clouds pretending to be the sky itself? This realization changes the relationship between consciousness and thought completely. Because the moment you notice the voice objectively, a small distance appears between awareness and thinking. You begin realizing that thoughts happen inside you, but may not define you. And strangely, this is where many people begin feeling both freedom and fear at the same time. Freedom, because painful thoughts lose some authority. Fear, because identity suddenly feels less solid. If the voice is not fully you, then what are you exactly? The question becomes difficult to answer, and perhaps that discomfort is why people stay trapped inside constant mental noise. Continuous thinking creates the feeling of identity stability. The narration maintains the illusion of a permanent self moving consistently through time. Without the narration, silence begins opening underneath. A silence the ego finds deeply unsettling, because inside silence, the familiar boundaries of identity soften. For a brief moment, you stop feeling like a fixed story. You simply feel aware, present. For Vanishes, existing before language fully organizes experience. And maybe that is why moments of deep presence feel so powerful. Watching rain quietly, listening to distant waves, sitting alone late at night when thought slows naturally. In those moments, the mind briefly stops narrating reality, and reality suddenly feels more direct, more alive, almost untouched by interpretation. But then the voice returns again. It always does, commenting, explaining ownership of experience afterward. And perhaps that is not entirely bad. Thought is useful. Human civilization itself depends on language and internal abstraction. Without thought, there would be no philosophy, art, memory, planning, or meaning-making. The problem is not thinking. The problem is forgetting that thinking is only one layer of consciousness, not the entirety of what you are. And honestly, if these ideas are making you pause for a moment, if they are slowing your thoughts down even slightly tonight, then that means more than you probably realize. Videos like these take an enormous amount of time to shape carefully, especially when trying to keep every paradox immersive, calm, and meaningful without breaking the rhythm of the experience. So if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into impossible thoughts, you can quietly support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and staying with us for future explorations. It truly helps keep these long-form paradox videos alive. Now, return to the thought itself. Because there is another strange detail about the inner voice most people never notice. The voice often speaks as though it knows reality completely. It creates certainty instantly. This person dislikes me. This situation will go badly. This feeling will last forever. But thoughts are interpretations, not reality itself. The voice constructs stories continuously from incomplete information, and consciousness suffers whenever those stories are mistaken for absolute truth. This is especially visible during anxiety. Fearful thoughts repeat so convincingly that the body begins reacting as though imagined futures are already real. The inner voice becomes a machine generating emotional realities from possibilities alone, and yet If you sit quietly enough, you notice something extraordinary. Every thought eventually disappears. Even the loudest fear fades temporarily. Even obsessive loops break eventually. Even painful inner narratives dissolve back into silence for brief moments. Thought is movement, awareness remains. This means the voice pretending to be you is not stable at all. It is temporary activity appearing inside something deeper. And maybe that deeper awareness cannot easily be described because language itself belongs to thought. The moment you try explaining pure awareness completely, the mind turns it back into concepts again. Words pointing towards something beyond words. Still, everyone has felt it at least once. Moments when the internal voice quiets unexpectedly and reality feels strangely immediate. Moments where existence appears before thought can fully divide it into labels and judgments. A sunset, music, love, grief, exhaustion, silence. For a few seconds, the self-story weakens and awareness remains by itself. And perhaps this is the most impossible thought of all. The person you believe yourself to be may exist mostly as continuous narration, a story repeated so often that consciousness mistakes it for permanent identity. But beneath the story, beneath the voice, beneath every thought pretending to be you, something quieter has been listening the entire time. Reality that changes when noticed. Familian beings assume observation is passive. You look at the world, and the world simply exists the same way, regardless of whether you notice it or not. A tree remains a tree. A room remains a room. Reality appears fixed, stable, independent from attention itself. But deep beneath ordinary life lies one of the strangest discoveries ever encountered by the human mind. Observation changes reality. At first, this sounds impossible, almost mystical. But the deeper science explored the foundations of existence, the more unsettling the universe became. In the quantum world, particles behave differently when measured. Before observation, reality exists in strange states of possibility, uncertain, fluid, unresolved. But the moment measurement occurs, those possibilities collapse into specific outcomes, as if reality itself waits for interaction before fully deciding what it is. No one fully understands why. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this: the universe becomes less predictable the closer you examine it. Particles behave like waves. Waves behave like particles. Matter appears influenced by probabilities until observation forces definition. The deeper reality is studied, the less reality behaves like ordinary common sense. And suddenly an impossible thought emerges. What if certainty itself is partly created through observation? At first, this seems limited only to physics, but something strangely similar appears inside human consciousness too. Attention changes experience constantly. The moment you focus on your breathing, breathing changes. The moment you observe your emotions carefully, emotions shift shape. The moment you become aware of awkwardness, awkwardness intensifies. Observation alters the thing being observed. Even psychologically, reality is not entirely passive. Imagine entering a room filled with people. If you believe everyone is judging you, your behavior changes immediately. Body language tightens, speech becomes unnatural, anxiety increases. Eventually, others may genuinely respond differently to your discomfort. Your perception influenced behavior, and behavior reshaped reality. The mind participates in constructing experience far more than people realize, and perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in relationships. The way you perceive someone changes the version of themselves they reveal around you. Expectations subtly shape interaction. Attention changes emotional dynamics continuously. Prominent beings become different depending on how they are seen. A person treated as intelligent often grows more confident intellectually. A child repeatedly told they are inadequate may slowly organize identity around that expectation. Observation becomes psychological architecture. Reality bends around attention, and this leads to a terrifying possibility. Maybe there is no fully objective human reality untouched by perception. Every experience arrives filtered through awareness. The brain selects what to notice, what to ignore, what to interpret as meaningful or threatening. Consciousness edits existence continuously before you even realize it. You do not experience raw reality. You experience reality processed through attention. This explains why two people can live through the same event, yet experience entirely different worlds afterward. One notices beauty, another notices danger. One remembers connection, another remembers humiliation. The external event may remain identical, but awareness reshapes emotional reality completely, and attention itself is deeply unstable. What you notice becomes your world. A fearful mind notices threats everywhere. A lonely mind notices rejection everywhere. A grateful mind notices beauty hidden inside ordinary moments. The world changes depending on the structure of awareness observing it, not entirely, but enough to transform human experience profoundly. This becomes even stranger when you realize how much reality remains invisible until attention reveals it. You can live beside something for years without truly seeing it. Then suddenly, after becoming aware of it once, you notice it everywhere. A symbol, a pattern, a type of car, a behavior. It is as if attention illuminates pieces of existence previously hidden inside unconscious perception. The information was always there, but your reality did not include it yet, and perhaps that is because consciousness cannot process everything simultaneously. The brain simplifies overwhelming complexity by filtering reality aggressively. Attention acts like a spotlight inside infinite darkness. Whatever falls outside the beam barely exists psychologically. This means every human being lives inside a partially constructed reality defined by limited awareness. Not false reality, incomplete reality, and maybe that is why certainty becomes dangerous. The moment people believe they see reality completely, attention stops expanding. The mind closes itself inside fixed interpretation. But existence may be far stranger than any single perspective can fully contain. Even identity changes through observation. The more intensely you analyze yourself, the more unstable the self can feel. Thoughts behave differently when examined directly. Emotions shift when labeled consciously. The simple act of introspection alters internal experience. It is almost as if consciousness cannot fully observe itself without transformation occurring, like water changing shape the moment you try holding it tightly. And this creates one of the deepest paradoxes of awareness. You want to understand reality clearly, but observation itself changes what is being understood. The observer cannot remain fully separate from the observed. Perhaps this is why complete objectivity feels unreachable. Human beings are not outside reality studying it from distance. They are expressions of reality attempting to understand themselves from within, the universe observing itself through temporary conscious forms. And maybe this explains something haunting about modern life. People increasingly direct attention toward fear, outrage, comparison, and endless stimulation. Over time, awareness organizes reality around those patterns. The world begins feeling more hostile, empty, fragmented, and exhausting. Attention shapes psychological existence slowly and invisibly. Whatever you repeatedly notice grows stronger inside consciousness. Fear grows through attention. Desire grows through attention. Meaning grows through attention. Even suffering grows when constantly fed by awareness looping around it endlessly. But the opposite is also true. Moments of beauty become more real when deeply noticed. Connection becomes more alive through presence. Silence becomes richer through awareness. The human experience expands toward whatever consciousness consistently touches. And perhaps that is the final impossible thought. Reality is not entirely separate from the way you look at it. Not because the external world is imaginary, but because awareness itself is part of reality's unfolding. The observer changes the experience. The attention changes the meaning. The noticing changes the world. And late at night, when existence suddenly feels strange and fragile, you begin realizing something unsettling. You are not merely living inside reality. You are participating in its continuous creation every moment you notice it. Control that exists only as an illusion. Human beings are obsessed with control. Control over time, control over emotions, control over the future, control over how others see them. Almost every structure of modern life exists partly to reduce uncertainty. Schedules, routines, goals, plans, insurance, laws, predictions, systems, all attempts to create stability inside a reality that never stops changing. Because uncertainty frightens the mind. The ego survives by believing life can be managed carefully enough to prevent chaos. But beneath that comforting belief lies an impossible thought. Most control may be an illusion created to protect consciousness from fear. At first, this feels exaggerated. Of course, people have some control. You can choose actions, make decisions, organize your environment. Civilization itself proves humans influence reality constantly. But influence is not the same as control. And the deeper you examine existence, the more fragile control begins to appear. Your heart beats without permission. Thoughts appear before you choose them. Emotions shift unexpectedly. A single phone call can change your life permanently within seconds. Entire futures collapse because of accidents, illnesses, timing, weather, strangers, or events no mind could fully predict. Reality keeps reminding humanity of the same uncomfortable truth. Life does not negotiate with certainty. Still, the mind continues searching for control endlessly. Because the feeling of control creates psychological safety, it reduces anxiety temporarily. If you believe everything depends entirely on your actions, uncertainty feels manageable. But paradoxically, this illusion often creates suffering too. People exhaust themselves trying to control things fundamentally beyond their reach. How others feel, how the past happened, how quickly healing occurs, how long love lasts, how the future unfolds. And when reality refuses to obey, frustration appears, then fear, then deeper control. The mind tightens harder against uncertainty, believing more effort will finally create stability. But life keeps moving anyway, like trying to hold water still with closed fists. The tighter the grip becomes, the faster the water escapes. And perhaps nowhere is this paradox more visible than inside the mind itself. People constantly attempt to control thoughts directly. Do not think about this. Stop feeling anxious. Calm down. But forced control over consciousness often creates the opposite effect. The more aggressively you resist certain thoughts, the stronger they return. Try forcing yourself not to think about something frightening. The mind immediately circles back toward it. This happens because attention itself feeds mental activity. Resistance keeps the unwanted thought emotionally alive, and suddenly another impossible truth emerges. Sometimes the need for control is what creates inner chaos. Anxiety grows stronger when the mind demands certainty about uncertain things. Fear intensifies when emotions are treated like enemies needing suppression. Suffering deepens when reality refuses to match internal expectations of how life should behave. The ego interprets uncertainty as failure, but uncertainty may simply be the natural condition of existence. Still, humans continue building identities around control. Success becomes associated with mastery over life. People admire confidence, discipline, dominance, precision. The image of being fully in control appears powerful, yet beneath many carefully controlled lives exists quiet exhaustion. Because maintaining psychological control constantly requires enormous energy. Suppressing vulnerability, managing appearance, predicting outcomes, avoiding uncertainty, protecting identity, the self becomes a project endlessly defended against chaos. And eventually something breaks. A relationship, a belief, a future plan, a body. Reality always moves beyond prediction eventually. And strangely, many people only begin feeling truly alive after control partially collapses. Moments of surrender often reveal unexpected freedom, falling deeply in love despite uncertainty, creating art without knowing the outcome, traveling without complete plans, sitting quietly without forcing the mind to become different. In those moments, life feels less mechanical, more immediate, more real, because direct experience returns when the obsession with controlling experience weakens. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean abandoning responsibility or action. Humans still shape reality meaningfully through choices and effort, but there is a difference between participating in life and demanding absolute control over life. One flows with uncertainty, the other fights endlessly against it, and the universe always wins eventually. Even time itself reveals the illusion clearly. No matter how carefully you organize existence, moments disappear continuously. Childhood vanishes, people change, bodies age, memories distort. Entire phases of life end quietly without permission. The mind wants permanence. Reality offers movement, and perhaps that is why death terrifies the ego so deeply. Death represents the final collapse of personal control, the ultimate reminder that existence was never fully possessed to begin with. Yet ironically, awareness of mortality often makes life more vivid, because once you realize control is incomplete, presence becomes more valuable than certainty. People stop postponing existence, waiting for perfect conditions. They begin appreciating fragile moments exactly because they cannot be permanently controlled. A sunset becomes beautiful partly because it disappears. Love becomes meaningful partly because it is vulnerable. Life becomes precious partly because it cannot be held forever. Still, the illusion of control remains seductive. The mind constantly whispers, if you think hard enough, if you prepare enough, if you worry enough, you can finally become safe. But complete safety never arrives. Reality remains unpredictable. Consciousness remains temporary, and maybe this is not a flaw in existence. Maybe it is what gives existence aliveness in the first place. A perfectly controlled universe would feel static, mechanical, dead. Uncertainty allows surprise, growth, transformation, wonder. The unknown is frightening, but it is also where all possibility lives. And perhaps the deepest paradox of all is this. The moment people stop demanding absolute control over life, they often experience more peace than control ever gave them. Because suffering decreases when reality is allowed to move naturally, instead of constantly being resisted. Late at night, this truth becomes strangely visible. You realize how much energy was spent trying to manage things no human mind could fully command. How many fears came from needing certainty? How much exhaustion came from resisting change itself? And quietly, beneath all that struggle, another possibility begins appearing. Maybe life was never asking you to control every moment. Maybe it was only asking you to experience it while it passes through your hands. Present moment that vanishes when observed. The present moment feels obvious, so obvious that most people never question it. You believe you are living inside now, continuously. This second feels immediate, real, directly experienced. But the moment you try to hold the present still, something strange happens. It disappears. You attempt to focus completely on the exact instant called now, yet before the mind can fully capture it, the moment has already become memory. The present keeps escaping observation, and once you notice this, time itself begins feeling deeply unsettling. Because where exactly is the present moment? Think carefully. The past is gone. The future has not happened yet. So life must exist in the present. But how long is the present actually? A second? A millisecond? Even smaller? The problem is that any measurable amount of time can still be divided further. And once divided, part of it belongs to the past, while another part belongs to the future. The now you try to isolate keeps collapsing into movement, like trying to hold flowing water in place with your hands. And perhaps this is why consciousness feels so mysterious. Awareness seems to move continuously through time, yet no one can fully locate the exact present it moves through. By the time the brain processes experience, the moment already passed. Neuroscience reveals something deeply strange about perception. Your conscious awareness operates slightly behind reality. The brain requires tiny amounts of time to process sensory information, organize it, and construct conscious experience. In other words, what feels like immediate reality is already delayed slightly by the time you become aware of it. You are always experiencing a version of the past, even now. The screen before you, the sound around you, the feeling of your body, all of it arrives milliseconds after the events themselves occurred, and suddenly an impossible thought appears. Perhaps the present moment is never directly experienced at all. Perhaps consciousness only experiences echoes arriving just after reality unfolds. At first, this seems insignificant. A tiny delay means nothing practically, but philosophically it changes everything, because human beings build identity around continuity through time. The self feels stable because awareness appears to move smoothly from one moment into the next. But if the present cannot truly be held, then existence may be less solid than it feels, more like continuous disappearance. Every second dies instantly after arriving. Every experience vanishes while happening. Life is not merely moving through time. Life is dissolving into memory continuously. And perhaps that is why nostalgia feels so haunting. The mind desperately reaches backward, trying to revisit moments already gone forever. Childhood, conversations, ordinary evenings once ignored. The present always feels endless while happening, until suddenly it becomes unreachable. Humans realize the value of moments mostly after they disappear, because awareness rarely notices life fully while life is occurring. Thought interrupts constantly. The mind compares the present to the past, projects into the future, analyzes, judges, worries, and while thinking about life, life quietly passes underneath thought itself. This creates one of the strangest paradoxes of consciousness. The harder you try to capture the present moment mentally, the less directly you experience it. Observation creates distance. The mind turns living experience into concept, like stopping a song repeatedly to understand music while missing the music itself. And yet people continue searching obsessively for being present. Meditation, mindfulness, silence, breathing exercises, not because humans suddenly became spiritual by accident, but because modern consciousness increasingly feels disconnected from direct experience. Attention is constantly pulled elsewhere, into memory, into anticipation, into endless mental simulation. The present becomes thin, fragmented, half-lived. And perhaps this is why certain rare moments feel almost sacred. Watching snow fall quietly, hearing distant rain at night, looking into someone's eyes without distraction, moments where thought briefly slows and awareness touches experience more directly than usual. During those moments, time feels different, less divided, almost suspended. Not because the present stops vanishing, but because consciousness temporarily stops resisting its movement. Still, the paradox remains. You can never fully freeze now. The instant you recognize a moment consciously, it already begins turning into memory. This becomes deeply unsettling when thinking about life itself. People spend years waiting for the real moment to arrive someday. Future happiness, future peace, future meaning. But when the future arrives, it appears only as another present moment already disappearing while being noticed. The mind chases permanence inside something fundamentally impermanent, and suffering often grows from that contradiction. Humans want moments to stay, love to stay, bodies to stay, identity to stay. But reality behaves more like flowing current than stable structure. Everything changes while existing. Nothing holds still long enough to possess completely. Even the self transforms continuously from moment to moment. Thoughts shift, emotions evolve, cells replace themselves. Memory rewrites experience. The person you were years ago already vanished psychologically in countless invisible ways. Yet consciousness still creates the feeling of continuity, a story moving through endless disappearance. And maybe that story exists because the mind cannot emotionally survive experiencing reality as pure impermanence all the time. So it creates stability, narrative, identity, time, useful illusions allowing temporary beings to function inside constant change. But late at night, when the world grows quiet enough, you can sometimes feel the strange fragility underneath everything. The realization that this exact moment will never exist again. That even while reading these words, this version of you is already slipping into the past. The breath you just took is gone forever. The silence between thoughts is already disappearing, and perhaps that sounds frightening at first. But strangely, it can also make existence feel more beautiful, because impermanence gives moments weight. A sunset matters because it fades. Music moves people because notes disappear the instant they arrive. Life feels precious because it cannot be permanently held. The vanishing is part of the meaning, and maybe the final impossible thought is this: the present moment cannot be captured because reality was never meant to become static. It was meant to be lived while disappearing. A moving miracle consciousness briefly touches before it dissolves into memory again. Meaning created by minds that need meaning. Human beings cannot tolerate emptiness for very long. Not physical emptiness, existential emptiness, the terrifying possibility that reality may not contain inherent meaning at all. Because if existence itself has no built-in purpose, then every human life becomes frighteningly open, fragile, undefined, suspended inside a universe that does not automatically explain why it exists. And the mind rebels against this immediately. It searches for meaning everywhere, in success, in love, in religion, in suffering, in identity, in achievement, in stories. Humans constantly build systems explaining why life matters, because consciousness seems psychologically unable to survive comfortably without some form of meaning holding reality together. But here is the impossible thought. What if meaning is not discovered? What if meaning is created? At first, this idea feels unsettling. People want meaning to exist independently of them. Objective meaning feels safer because it appears permanent and external. If purpose exists out there somewhere, life feels grounded. But if meaning comes from the mind itself, then meaning becomes strangely subjective, flexible, fragile, human-made, and suddenly reality feels less stable than before. Think about money for a moment. A piece of paper has value only because human minds collectively agree it matters. Without shared belief, it becomes ordinary material instantly. The same applies to borders, status, traditions, symbols, titles, reputations, and countless structures organizing civilization. Meaning emerges through shared psychological agreement. Humans create invisible frameworks, then live inside them as though they were objective reality itself. And perhaps nowhere is this more powerful than identity. People suffer enormously over labels, expectations, and narratives because the mind attaches meaning to them deeply. But the universe itself does not announce these meanings independently. Consciousness creates them. This realization becomes deeply strange when examining emotions. Why does one moment feel meaningful while another feels empty? Objectively, both moments simply exist. Yet awareness transforms certain experiences into significance through interpretation. A song becomes sacred because of memory. A location becomes emotional because of love or grief. An ordinary object becomes priceless because of personal attachment. Meaning changes reality psychologically. Not physically perhaps, but experientially. And human beings live inside experience. This suggests something unsettling. Life may not arrive already filled with meaning. Consciousness may be the thing generating meaning inside otherwise indifferent existence. At first, this can feel horrifying. If meaning is created rather than guaranteed, then nothing is automatically sacred. No cosmic force ensures purpose exists universally. Human beings become temporary minds, inventing significance inside vast uncertainty. But strangely, this idea can also become liberating. Because if meaning is created, then existence remains open, flexible, alive. People are not trapped waiting to discover one single universal purpose assigned to them from outside. They participate in creating meaning through attention, connection, experience, and interpretation. Still, the mind fears this freedom. Because freedom without guaranteed meaning feels dangerously close to chaos. This is why people cling so tightly to ideologies, identities, routines, and belief systems. Not merely because they seek truth, but because they seek psychological stability. Meaning protects the mind from existential terror. Without meaning, suffering becomes difficult to justify emotionally. Pain feels unbearable when it appears random. Loss feels heavier when it lacks narrative. Humans survive hardship partly by turning suffering into story. This happened for a reason. This will make me stronger. This pain has purpose. The mind creates meaning to endure reality emotionally. And perhaps that is not weakness. Perhaps it is one of consciousness's most extraordinary abilities. After all, humans transform chaos into art, loneliness into music, grief into poetry, silence into philosophy. The universe may not provide built-in meaning, yet minds continuously create beauty from existence anyway. Still, there remains something haunting about the possibility that meaning itself depends on fragile consciousness, because consciousness is temporary. One day every thought, memory, dream, ambition, and personal meaning attached to your identity will disappear. Entire civilizations eventually vanish too. Languages die, cultures collapse, stars themselves burn out eventually. From a cosmic perspective, meaning appears astonishingly fragile, and this leads many people toward despair. They ask, if everything disappears eventually, then what is the point? But perhaps that question itself reveals the mind's misunderstanding. Why must meaning be permanent to be real? A song still matters even after it ends. A sunset still matters even though it fades. Love still matters despite mortality. Temporary things can possess profound meaning precisely because they are temporary. Impermanence may intensify meaning rather than destroy it. And perhaps this is why human beings instinctively search for beauty during painful moments. Awareness recognizes fragility unconsciously. The mind senses how quickly experiences vanish. Meaning grows partly from vulnerability. A perfectly permanent universe might feel emotionally empty, because urgency disappears without loss. Value disappears without limitation. The finite gives emotional weight to existence. Still, another impossible thought quietly waits beneath all of this. If meaning is created by minds, then reality without consciousness may contain neither meaning nor meaninglessness, only existence, silent, uninterpreted. The universe itself may not care whether life matters, but consciousness cares deeply, and perhaps consciousness caring is where meaning begins. Not as objective law written into reality, but as living experience emerging inside awareness. A parent holding a child, a stranger showing kindness, a lonely person hearing words that make them feel understood. These moments matter because conscious beings experience them as meaningful. Meaning lives through perception, through relationship, through felt existence itself. And maybe that is enough. Late at night, when the world becomes quiet and distant, this paradox feels strangely beautiful. You realize humans are temporary creatures inside an unimaginably vast universe, yet they still create love, art, memory, wonder, and connection, despite knowing everything eventually fades. Consciousness keeps creating meaning inside uncertainty anyway, like small lights appearing briefly in endless darkness. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: meaning may not be something waiting hidden inside reality. Meaning may be what reality becomes the moment consciousness begins caring about it at all. Self that exists differently in every person. There is a version of you that exists inside every mind you have ever met. A different version inside your parents, another inside old friends, another inside strangers passing you briefly. Some remember you as kind, others remember you as distant. Some see confidence, others see fear. And none of these versions are completely identical to the person you believe yourself to be. At first, this feels normal. Of course, people perceive others differently, but the deeper you think about it, the stranger identity becomes. Because no one has ever experienced the real you directly, not even you. Every human being interacts only with interpretations, memories, impressions, fragments, and suddenly an impossible thought begins to emerge. If every person carries a different version of you in their mind, then which one is actually real? The mind desperately wants a stable answer, a fixed identity, a true self existing independently beneath all perception. But reality becomes difficult the moment you examine it closely. The version of you your childhood friend remembers no longer fully exists. The version your family sees may differ completely from the version co-workers experience. Even the version of yourself inside your own memory changes constantly over time. Identity becomes fluid depending on perspective, relational, almost impossible to isolate completely. And perhaps the strangest part is this: you will never fully know most versions of yourself that exist in other people's minds. Some stranger may remember one sentence you said years ago that changed their life completely, while you forgot the moment entirely. Someone may secretly associate you with comfort, another with pain, another with inspiration, another with regret. Entire emotional realities connected to your existence unfold invisibly beyond your awareness. You continue living normally while countless unseen versions of you survive inside other consciousnesses, and none of them are fully under your control. This is deeply unsettling for the ego. People spend enormous energy trying to manage perception, appearance, reputation, identity. They want to control how others see them, because social reality shapes psychological survival profoundly. But complete control over perception is impossible. No matter what you say or do, each mind interprets you through its own history, fears, desires, expectations, and emotional wounds. People do not see you objectively. They see you filtered through themselves. A kind action may appear manipulative to one person and loving to another. Silence may seem peaceful to some and cold to others. Even truth changes shape through interpretation. And perhaps this explains why being misunderstood feels so painful. Because the self you experience internally often feels invisible compared to the version perceived externally. Humans crave recognition not merely socially, but existentially. People want someone to truly see them, but complete understanding between minds may be impossible. Every consciousness remains partially isolated inside its own perspective. Even language cannot fully transfer experience. You can describe sadness endlessly, but no one feels your exact sadness directly. You can explain memories, fears, hopes, but the internal reality behind them always remains partly inaccessible. The self cannot be perfectly transmitted between minds, only approximated. And yet humans continue trying, through conversation, art, music, love, storytelling, all attempts to bridge the distance between isolated consciousnesses. And sometimes, briefly, connection feels real enough to soften the separation. Still, the paradox remains. You are simultaneously one person and many people at once. Not because you are fake, but because identity itself changes relationally. Different environments activate different emotional structures inside you. Different people bring forward different traits, memories, energies, and behaviors. You are not exactly the same self everywhere, and perhaps no one truly is. Modern psychology increasingly suggests personality is less fixed than humans assume. Context influences behavior enormously. The self behaves more like a dynamic process, adapting continuously rather than a single permanent entity. Yet consciousness still creates the feeling of one stable me moving through all these versions. Why? Maybe because the mind requires narrative continuity to survive psychologically. Identity acts like glue, organizing countless shifting experiences into one coherent story. But stories simplify reality, and reality is often far stranger underneath. This becomes especially unsettling online. In digital spaces, entire identities form from fragments alone. A profile picture, a sentence, a post. People construct complete psychological images of strangers they barely know. Humans constantly create imagined versions of one another from incomplete information, and sometimes those imagined versions become more emotionally powerful than reality itself. The self becomes projection, reflection, interpretation layered endlessly upon interpretation, like mirrors facing mirrors forever. But there is another side to this paradox too. If identity exists differently in every person, then parts of you survive beyond your own awareness. A kindness you forgot may still comfort someone years later. A moment of love may continue shaping another life long after memory fades for you. Even after death, versions of you remain alive inside memories carried by others. Not perfectly, not permanently, but meaningfully. Fragments of your existence continue echoing through different minds, and perhaps that is what human immortality truly looks like. Not one fixed self surviving forever, but countless impressions continuing briefly through consciousness connected to yours. Still, late at night, the realization becomes haunting. You will never fully know who you were to most people. You will never see yourself exactly as others saw you. Some versions of you already disappeared completely when certain people left your life forever. Others still exist somewhere quietly inside minds you no longer speak to. And even now, while reading these words, another invisible version of you is being formed inside your own awareness. A story about who you think you are. A story changing constantly. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this. The self may not be one fixed identity hidden somewhere inside you. The self may be a living network of perceptions, memories, emotions and reflections, existing differently in every consciousness it touches. A shifting human presence, becoming someone slightly different every time it is seen. Truth that feels impossible to accept. Some truths do not feel false because they lack evidence. They feel false because accepting them would change too much inside you. The human mind likes to imagine itself as rational, objective, open to reality wherever reality leads. But deep beneath consciousness exists another force far stronger than logic. The need for psychological stability, because certain truths threaten the structure holding identity together. And when identity feels endangered, the mind does something strange. It resists reality itself, not consciously, not maliciously, automatically, like a body pulling away from fire before thought fully forms. This means people often reject truths not because those truths are impossible, but because they are emotionally unbearable. At first, this sounds obvious. Everyone knows denial exists. But the deeper you examine it, the more unsettling it becomes, because the mind filters reality constantly in order to protect itself. Humans ignore information contradicting deeply held beliefs. They reinterpret uncomfortable evidence. They remember events selectively. Entire worldviews can survive enormous contradictions because identity depends on them emotionally. The brain does not seek truth alone. It seeks survivable truth. And survivable truth is not always the same thing. Think about mortality. Every human being knows intellectually that death is unavoidable. Yet most people move through ordinary life without emotionally experiencing that reality fully. The mind keeps mortality abstract because constant awareness of impermanence would become psychologically overwhelming. But occasionally the illusion weakens. A funeral, a diagnosis, a sudden loss. And for a brief moment, reality feels terrifyingly direct. You realize life is fragile in a way the mind usually hides from itself. Not theoretically, actually, and consciousness recoils, because some truths feel too large for the ego to hold comfortably. This happens not only with death, but with identity itself. Many people secretly sense they are living according to expectations they never truly chose, yet fully admitting this would require enormous change. So the mind creates distraction instead. Routine, noise, constant movement, anything preventing direct confrontation with uncomfortable awareness. Humans often stay inside familiar suffering because unknown truth feels more frightening than predictable pain. And perhaps this is why silence can feel dangerous. In silence, hidden truths begin surfacing. The mind loses some ability to escape itself. Questions appear. Am I truly happy? Do I actually believe what I claim to believe? Who would I be without this identity? And the deeper the question cuts into the structure of self, the more resistance emerges automatically. Because the ego survives through continuity. It builds identity carefully from memories, beliefs, roles, desires, fears, and narratives. Anything threatening those structures feels existentially dangerous even when no physical threat exists. A truth capable of dissolving identity can feel emotionally identical to survival threat. This explains why humans defend worldviews with extraordinary intensity. Arguments about politics, religion, morality, and meaning often become emotional because they are tied directly to psychological structure. People are not merely defending opinions, they are defending the architecture of the self. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this. You may already carry truths inside you that you instinctively avoid seeing clearly. Not because you are dishonest, but because consciousness protects itself automatically. The mind is remarkably skilled at hiding things from itself while believing it is fully aware. Psychologists sometimes call this motivated reasoning. Awareness bends subtly toward conclusions, preserving emotional stability. The self creates explanations supporting identity continuity without fully realizing it. Humans are not neutral observers of reality. They are emotionally invested participants inside it. And this creates one of the deepest paradoxes of consciousness. The truths most capable of transforming your life are often the truths the mind resists hardest, because real transformation threatens the old self. A person cannot become psychologically new without part of the previous identity dissolving first, and dissolution frightens the ego profoundly. Still, throughout history, human beings have repeatedly pursued truth despite discomfort. Philosophers questioned reality itself. Scientists challenged entire civilizations of belief. Mystics abandoned identity, searching for deeper understanding. Artists exposed emotional truths society preferred hiding. Again and again, consciousness moved toward uncomfortable reality, even while fearing it. Perhaps because somewhere deep inside, humans recognize that avoiding truth creates another kind of suffering. False stability, hidden emptiness, a life performed rather than lived, and eventually the tension becomes unbearable. The mind grows exhausted, maintaining illusions indefinitely, because reality does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It waits quietly underneath. This becomes deeply visible in relationships. People often sense truths long before consciously admitting them. A connection weakening, a hidden resentment, emotional distance growing slowly over time. But acknowledgement threatens security, so the mind delays, explains, minimizes, until eventually reality forces itself forward anyway, and the painful truth that once seemed impossible to accept becomes undeniable. Yet strangely, after acceptance finally happens, many people feel unexpected relief, because resisting truth requires enormous energy. The ego tightens constantly against reality, trying to preserve familiar identity. Acceptance releases that tension, not because truth stops hurting, but because consciousness stops dividing itself against what already exists. And perhaps that is why certain difficult truths eventually become liberating, not immediately, but slowly. The collapse of illusion creates space for something more honest to emerge, still fragile, still uncertain, but real. Late at night, this paradox becomes deeply personal. You realize there may be truths inside yourself still waiting quietly beneath distraction. Truths about fear, about love, about loneliness, about the person you became, about the person you still pretend to be. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: the hardest truths to accept are often not hidden from you by the world. They are hidden by the parts of you still afraid of what reality would change if you finally allowed yourself to see clearly. Voice in your head that you never chose. There is a voice inside your mind speaking almost constantly. It comments on your life. It judges your decisions. It predicts the future. It replays old conversations long after they end. Sometimes it comforts you. Sometimes it destroys you. And because the voice has been there for as long as you can remember, most people assume it naturally belongs to them. But here is the impossible thought: you never actually chose that voice. Not its tone, not its language, not the fears hidden inside it. Not even the way it speaks to you when you are alone. The voice formed gradually from experiences you barely understood while they were shaping you. Parents, teachers, friends, strangers, failures, embarrassments, praise, shame. The mind absorbed countless emotional impressions during childhood especially, long before you possessed enough awareness to consciously decide who you wanted to become. And over time, those impressions merged together into internal narration. The voice in your head became a psychological echo chamber built partly from other people. At first, this feels unsettling because the inner voice seems deeply personal. It uses the word I. It feels intimate, familiar, constant. But if you listen carefully, you begin noticing traces of borrowed influence everywhere. A criticism sounding exactly like something once said to you years ago. A fear inherited from family. A standard of success absorbed from culture. A harshness you would never use toward someone you love, yet somehow direct toward yourself daily. The voice did not emerge in isolation. It was conditioned, shaped, programmed slowly by experience. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Most people never question the authority of the voice at all. If the inner narration says, "You are failing," consciousness reacts emotionally immediately. If it whispers, "Nobody truly cares about you," the body responds with pain. The mind treats internal language as truth automatically, simply because the voice sounds familiar. But familiarity is not the same as accuracy. The voice often repeats emotional conditioning rather than objective reality. And once you realize this, identity begins feeling unstable again. Because if the voice was shaped externally, then how much of your suffering truly belongs to you? Some people spend their entire lives carrying internal dialogue created by wounds that were never originally theirs. Childhood shame becomes adult self-hatred. Fear passed through generations quietly survives inside thought patterns. Social expectations become private emotional prisons. The mind keeps repeating inherited psychological structures long after their origins disappear, and consciousness mistakes repetition for selfhood. But repetition is not identity. A thought repeated thousands of times does not automatically become truth. Still, the inner voice feels incredibly convincing. Because the brain evolved to prioritize internal narration heavily. Language helps humans organize reality, predict outcomes, maintain identity continuity, and survive socially. The voice creates the feeling of a stable self moving through time. Without it, the ego weakens slightly. And perhaps that is why silence feels uncomfortable for many people. When external distractions disappear, the inner voice becomes impossible to ignore. Thoughts echo louder. Unresolved fears surface. Old emotional patterns replay automatically. The mind fills emptiness compulsively because silence threatens the structure of identity itself. Yet if you observe carefully, something strange becomes visible. The voice never truly stops changing. Some days it feels confident, other days terrified, sometimes compassionate, sometimes cruel. It shifts constantly depending on exhaustion, emotion, memory, chemistry, and circumstance. Which raises another unsettling question. If the voice changes so dramatically, why do you continue believing it defines who you are? Perhaps because humans confuse narration with consciousness itself. But awareness exists before language fully appears. Before the voice comments on experience, something is already present, noticing reality directly. You can hear the voice, which means awareness cannot be identical to the voice entirely. The observer exists separately enough to notice the narration happening. And maybe this explains why meditation, music, nature, or moments of awe feel so powerful psychologically. During those experiences, the internal voice briefly quiets and awareness remains without constant interpretation. Reality suddenly feels immediate, alive, unfiltered, not because thought disappears forever, but because consciousness stops identifying completely with the narration for a moment. Still, the voice always returns. It rebuilds the self-story continuously. This is who I am. This is what life means. This is what will happen next. And perhaps the mind needs some narration to function practically. Human life requires planning, memory, communication, reflection. The problem is not the existence of the voice. The problem is unconscious obedience to it, because the voice often speaks from fear rather than truth. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of uncertainty, fear of not being enough. The internal narrator constantly tries protecting identity from pain, even if that protection creates suffering itself. And maybe that is why people feel exhausted by their own minds sometimes. Not because consciousness is broken, but because the voice never learned how to stop surviving long enough to simply exist peacefully. Late at night, this becomes deeply visible. You notice how the inner voice keeps talking even when no problem actually exists in the present moment. It predicts future disasters, replays old mistakes, searches constantly for danger, meaning, certainty, control. The narration continues endlessly, as if silence itself feels unsafe. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: the voice in your head may not be the true center of who you are. It may simply be accumulated psychological noise, trying desperately to keep a fragile identity alive. A voice shaped by countless influences you never consciously chose, speaking inside awareness that existed quietly before the voice ever learned your name. Future that alters the moment you imagine it. The future does not exist yet. At least, that is what people believe. Tomorrow has not arrived. Next year remains unreal. The future appears distant, something waiting ahead beyond the present moment. And yet something deeply strange happens the instant you imagine it. Your body changes immediately. Your emotions change immediately. Your decisions change immediately. A future that does not yet exist begins reshaping the present as though it were already real. And suddenly an impossible thought appears. The future may be imaginary, yet it still controls human life constantly. Think about anxiety. Anxiety is rarely caused by the current moment itself. Most anxiety emerges from imagined futures. Something bad might happen, something could go wrong. Some painful possibility forms inside thought, and the nervous system reacts as if danger already exists physically. Heart rate changes, breathing shifts, muscles tighten. The body suffers inside futures that have not happened and may never happen. The mind possesses the terrifying ability to emotionally experience unreal events before reality arrives. But the opposite is also true. Hope changes the present too. A person imagining love feels warmth before love arrives. Someone dreaming about success gains motivation instantly. Expectation reshapes behavior long before reality confirms anything. The imagined future reaches backward into the present and changes it. And perhaps this is one of consciousness's strangest abilities. Humans do not merely experience reality, they experience possibilities. Animals mostly react to immediate conditions. Human beings, however, continuously simulate futures inside the mind. They rehearse conversations before they happen, predict outcomes, imagine disasters, build dreams, fear endings years before they arrive. Consciousness stretches itself across time psychologically, and sometimes it becomes trapped there, because the future carries enormous emotional power. A feared future can ruin the present. A hopeful future can sustain survival during suffering. Entire lives become organized around possibilities that do not yet exist. And the deeper you examine this, the stranger time itself begins to feel, because imagined futures influence real present behavior, which then changes the actual future outcome. A person fearing failure may avoid opportunities, creating the very future they feared. A person believing growth is possible may take risks, transforming reality through expectation itself. The future becomes partly self-constructing, not magically, psychologically. Attention, emotion, and behavior shift according to anticipated reality, and anticipated reality often shapes lived reality afterward. This creates an unsettling paradox. Human beings are controlled partly by events that have not happened yet. The imagined future possesses real psychological gravity. Even memory interacts with the future strangely. People often reinterpret the past based on anticipated futures. A painful experience suddenly feels meaningful if it seems connected to future growth. A relationship feels tragic or beautiful depending on how the future unfolds afterward. The future changes the emotional meaning of the past. Time itself becomes psychologically fluid, not linear, interconnected, and perhaps this explains why uncertainty feels so difficult for the human mind. The brain evolved to predict reality because prediction improves survival. Knowing what might happen allows preparation. But modern consciousness extended prediction far beyond immediate survival. Now humans attempt predicting identity, purpose, relationships, success, happiness, even meaning itself. The mind searches endlessly for certainty about futures fundamentally unknowable, and suffering grows from that impossible demand. Because reality refuses complete prediction. No matter how carefully life is planned, the future remains partly hidden. Entire destinies change because of random timing, unexpected encounters, accidents, illness, loss, or opportunities no mind could foresee. Still, the brain keeps simulating futures constantly, trying to reduce uncertainty, trying to feel safe, trying to control what has not happened yet. But perhaps the deepest irony is this. The more intensely people live inside imagined futures, the less fully they experience the only moment actually happening. The present becomes sacrificed to anticipation. Some people spend their entire lives waiting emotionally for the future to finally begin. Future success, future peace, future love, future meaning. But when the future arrives, it appears only as another present moment already disappearing while being noticed. The mind keeps postponing existence into time that never truly arrives the way imagination promised. And maybe that is why moments of deep presence feel almost shocking psychologically. Watching rain quietly, hearing distant thunder, laughing without self-consciousness. During those moments, the future briefly loosens its grip. Consciousness stops projecting itself forward constantly. Life feels direct again, immediate, alive, not because the future disappears, but because awareness temporarily stops abandoning the present for imagined possibilities. Still, humans cannot entirely escape the future psychologically. Imagination is part of consciousness itself. Dreams matter, planning matters, hope matters. The ability to imagine tomorrow helped humanity survive and evolve. The problem begins when imagined futures become more emotionally real than lived reality itself. When fear about tomorrow destroys today, when hope becomes endless postponement, when the mind becomes trapped in futures instead of participating in existence now. And perhaps nowhere is this more haunting than in regret. People often suffer not because of what happened, but because of futures they imagined differently. An unlived possibility continues haunting consciousness. The imagined life becomes emotionally real enough to mourn. A future that never existed still creates genuine grief. This reveals something extraordinary about the human mind. Possibility itself can become emotionally real. And maybe this is why storytelling, art and dreams affect people so deeply. Humans live partly inside imagination. Consciousness constantly moves beyond immediate reality into worlds that do not physically exist. The future is one of those worlds, a psychological landscape shaping the present continuously. Late at night, this paradox becomes deeply personal. You realize how much of your life has been guided by futures existing only inside thought. How many fears came from imagination? How many hopes carried you through darkness? How many decisions were shaped by possibilities not yet real? And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: the future may not physically exist yet, but the moment you imagine it, it begins changing who you are now. A world that has not happened, quietly rewriting the present from inside your own mind. Certainty built entirely on uncertainty. Human beings crave certainty more than almost anything else. Certainty feels safe, stable, predictable. The mind relaxes when it believes it understands reality clearly. Questions disappear, doubt weakens, identity feels solid again. But beneath nearly every certainty humans hold, uncertainty quietly remains. And once you notice this, the entire structure of belief begins feeling fragile. Because the deeper you examine reality, the harder absolute certainty becomes to find. Take science, for example. Science is humanity's greatest system for understanding existence. It reveals astonishing truths about the universe, yet science itself depends on continuous questioning. Every theory remains open to revision if new evidence appears. Even the most trusted knowledge contains uncertainty at its foundation. Not because science is weak, but because honest understanding recognizes its own limits, and this pattern appears everywhere. You trust memory despite knowing memory changes. You trust perception despite knowing perception can be distorted. You trust language despite knowing words simplify reality imperfectly. You trust the future despite never being able to fully predict it. Human life functions through assumptions that can never be proven with complete certainty. Yet consciousness behaves as though stability exists anyway. Why? Because the mind cannot survive psychologically in endless doubt. Imagine questioning every detail constantly. Is this real? Can I trust this memory? Do these people truly care about me? Will the future collapse tomorrow? A consciousness trapped in total uncertainty would struggle to function at all. So the brain constructs certainty partly for survival. Not always because certainty is objectively complete, but because stability allows action. This creates one of the deepest paradoxes of human existence. People build their lives upon foundations they can never fully verify. Love requires uncertainty. Trust requires uncertainty. Hope requires uncertainty. Even identity itself depends on uncertain continuity between past and present versions of the self. And yet humans continue living as though certainty exists, because without some form of psychological grounding, reality becomes emotionally unbearable. Still, uncertainty never fully disappears. It waits quietly beneath everything, beneath relationships, beneath beliefs, beneath meaning itself. A single moment can change entire lives unexpectedly. A hidden truth can collapse years of certainty instantly. The future always contains unknown possibilities no mind can fully control. And perhaps this is why certainty becomes dangerous when held too tightly. Absolute certainty closes perception. It stops curiosity, stops growth, stops humility. History is filled with suffering created by people completely certain they understood reality correctly. Religious certainty, political certainty, moral certainty, ideological certainty. The more absolute the belief, the more terrifyingly blind the mind can become. Because certainty often feels strongest precisely where uncertainty is greatest. Humans cling hardest to fixed answers when existence feels unstable. And maybe that explains something unsettling about identity too. People often define themselves through rigid narratives because fluid identity feels frightening. The ego wants stable definitions. This is who I am. This is what life means. This is what happens after death. But reality may be too complex for complete certainty in any of these areas. Consciousness exists inside mystery, whether it admits it or not. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Even doubt itself depends on uncertain assumptions. A person questioning reality still relies on thought to perform the questioning. The skeptic cannot escape uncertainty either. Every position eventually reaches unknown territory, like standing at the edge of a map fading into darkness. Still, humans continue searching for certainty endlessly, because uncertainty feels emotionally vulnerable. The unknown contains risk, loss, change, death. The ego wants guarantees against suffering, but reality never fully provides them. Love can disappear, bodies can fail, memories can fade, entire worlds can change overnight. Life keeps reminding consciousness of the same impossible truth. Stability is temporary, And yet, strangely, human beings continue finding meaning anyway. They continue loving despite uncertainty, creating despite uncertainty, dreaming despite uncertainty. Maybe because certainty was never actually required for existence to matter. Perhaps uncertainty is not a flaw in reality. Perhaps it is part of what makes consciousness alive. After all, surprise becomes impossible without uncertainty. Wonder disappears without mystery. Freedom disappears without unpredictability. A completely certain universe might feel emotionally dead, mechanical, frozen. Uncertainty allows possibility, transformation, discovery, and maybe this explains why some of the most profound human experiences happen when certainty collapses temporarily. Falling in love, traveling somewhere unknown, standing beneath stars, realizing how little you truly understand existence. During those moments, uncertainty does not feel like failure, it feels awe-inspiring. The unknown becomes beautiful instead of threatening. Still, late at night, the mind returns to certainty again, searching for guarantees, for answers, for stable ground beneath existence. And perhaps this search itself reveals something deeply human. Consciousness longs for permanence inside a universe built from change. It longs for certainty while living inside mystery. And maybe the final impossible thought is this: every certainty you possess rests upon assumptions you cannot completely prove, yet somehow human beings continue building entire lives, relationships, dreams, and identities on that fragile uncertainty anyway. Like temporary minds creating meaning while standing above an endless unknown they can never fully see through. Awareness that cannot fully see itself. Your eyes can see almost everything around you: the sky, the room, the movement of light across objects. But your eyes cannot directly see themselves completely without reflection. And perhaps consciousness suffers from the same paradox, because awareness can observe thoughts, observe emotions, observe memories, observe sensations, yet the one thing awareness can never fully observe directly is awareness itself. The moment consciousness tries turning completely toward itself, something strange happens. The observer becomes the observed, and the clearer you try to see yourself internally, the more impossible complete self-knowledge begins to feel. At first, this sounds abstract, philosophical, but the deeper you examine your own mind, the stranger it becomes. You know thoughts exist because you notice them. You know emotions exist because they appear inside awareness. But what exactly is the thing noticing? Most people answer automatically, me, but that answer explains almost nothing. What is the me made of? A body, thoughts, memory, identity? The deeper you search, the less solid the self becomes, because every part of yourself you can observe eventually appears as an object inside awareness. You can notice your body, so awareness cannot be identical only to the body. You can notice thoughts, so awareness cannot simply be thoughts. You can even observe emotions changing continuously, which means awareness remains present while emotional states come and go. And suddenly an impossible thought emerges. Perhaps awareness itself is not something consciousness can fully turn into an object, because awareness is the condition allowing objects to appear in the first place. like a flashlight trying to shine directly upon its own source, or a knife attempting to cut itself completely. The tool cannot fully separate itself from its own functioning, and maybe this explains why introspection eventually reaches limits, no matter how deeply people search. You can analyze identity endlessly, examine memories, question beliefs, observe mental patterns, but complete self-transparency never fully arrives. There always remains some invisible center doing the observing, a mystery quietly looking through your eyes. This becomes especially strange during moments of intense self-awareness. Sometimes you suddenly become aware that you are aware. For a brief instant, consciousness folds inward upon itself, and the experience feels almost dizzying, as though the mind glimpsed something too strange to fully conceptualize. Because awareness itself has no obvious shape, no color, no clear location. You cannot point directly to the exact place consciousness exists physically in experience. Even though awareness feels closer than anything else, it also remains impossible to fully grasp. It is the most familiar thing in existence and simultaneously the most mysterious. And perhaps this is why philosophy, spirituality, neuroscience and psychology all struggle endlessly to explain consciousness completely. The problem is not merely lack of intelligence. The problem may be structural. Consciousness is attempting to understand the very thing doing the understanding, reality investigating itself from within. And maybe certain questions remain permanently difficult because awareness cannot fully step outside itself to examine itself objectively. Just as a character inside a dream cannot easily observe the dreamer beyond the dream, still, humans continue searching. Meditation, science, psychedelics, philosophy, religion, countless attempts to understand the nature of consciousness more deeply. And many people report similar realizations eventually. The more directly awareness is observed, the less personal it begins to feel. Thoughts appear inside it, emotions appear inside it, identity appears inside it, but awareness itself remains strangely open, silent, difficult to define, almost boundaryless. This can feel liberating at first, but also deeply unsettling, because if awareness is deeper than identity, then who exactly are you? The ego wants a stable answer, a fixed self, a definable center, but awareness resists becoming fully defined. Every description turns into another thought appearing inside awareness rather than awareness itself. Language keeps pointing toward something it cannot fully capture, and perhaps this is why silence often feels closer to truth than explanation does. The moment the mind stops trying to define awareness intellectually, awareness still remains, present before concepts, present before identity narratives, present before the voice inside your head begins speaking again. Still, the paradox continues. Awareness can never fully see itself completely, because complete observation would require separation between observer and observed. But awareness is already the space where both appear. The observer cannot fully step outside the act of observing, and maybe that is why existence itself feels so mysterious, no matter how advanced human understanding becomes. Science can map brain activity beautifully. Philosophy can analyze consciousness endlessly, but the direct experience of awareness itself remains irreducible. No explanation replaces the actual feeling of being conscious right now, the simple, undeniable fact that experience exists at all. And perhaps this is the strangest thing in the universe. Not stars, not black holes, not time, but awareness itself. The fact that reality somehow became capable of experiencing itself subjectively through living minds. No one fully understands how or why. And late at night, when thought slows enough, this mystery can feel overwhelming. You suddenly realize you have existed inside consciousness your entire life without ever fully understanding what consciousness actually is. The one thing closest to you remains the most hidden, and perhaps the final impossible thought is this: awareness cannot fully see itself, for the same reason a mirror cannot completely reflect its own surface endlessly. The act of observing already contains the mystery being searched for. The seeker and the thing being sought were never entirely separate to begin with. Loop that begins every time it ends. Human beings believe life moves forward, beginning, middle, ending. That is how the mind understands existence. Time appears linear. Events seem to progress from one moment into the next, like a straight road disappearing into distance. But beneath ordinary experience lies a strange pattern repeating everywhere. Endings often become beginnings in disguise, and the deeper you examine reality, the more life begins feeling less like a straight line and more like a loop endlessly folding back into itself. Think about identity. You believe you are becoming someone new over time, yet many emotional patterns repeat across years in different forms. The same fears return wearing different faces. The same desires reappear inside new relationships. The same inner conflicts quietly rebuild themselves after every attempt to escape them. People change, yet somehow they remain trapped inside familiar cycles too. And perhaps the strangest part is this: many loops only continue because the mind believes they already ended. A person leaves one toxic relationship, then unconsciously creates another with similar emotional dynamics. Someone escapes childhood fear, only to rebuild the same fear inside adult ambition. The ego believes it is moving forward while silently recreating old psychological structures underneath. The loop survives by changing appearance. At first, this seems merely emotional or behavioral, but loops appear everywhere in existence itself. Stars die and become material for new stars. Forests burn and create conditions for new growth. Cells in your body die continuously, so life can continue. Even breathing itself is circular. Inhale, exhale, beginning and ending endlessly feeding each other. Reality appears obsessed with cycles, and suddenly an impossible thought emerges. What if endings do not truly exist the way the mind imagines them? What if reality transforms continuously rather than concludes? This becomes deeply unsettling when thinking about time itself. Human memory creates the feeling that life moves in one direction permanently. But psychologically, people revisit the past constantly. Old emotions return suddenly through smell, music, places, dreams. Memories reshape present identity years after events supposedly ended. The past survives invisibly inside the present. Nothing fully disappears psychologically. And maybe that is why grief feels so strange. People assume healing means complete closure, but many losses never fully vanish. They simply transform shape over time. The relationship ends physically, yet emotionally continues echoing through consciousness differently forever. The loop changes form. It does not entirely disappear. Even thoughts behave cyclically. Certain fears repeat endlessly. Desires return after temporary satisfaction fades. Questions reappear years later in slightly different language. The mind moves in circles while believing it travels straight. And perhaps nowhere is this paradox more disturbing than in self-improvement. People often believe happiness exists somewhere ahead, beyond one final solution, one final achievement, one final realization, one final transformation. But after each ending, another beginning quietly appears. The mind solves one problem only to create another, because identity itself survives through movement, through seeking, through continuation. The ego fears stillness, partly because stillness threatens the machinery, generating endless psychological loops. And perhaps this is why silence feels so uncomfortable sometimes. Without distraction, repetitive patterns become visible. The same internal narratives replay constantly. I will become enough someday. I just need to fix this one thing. Then I can finally rest. But the future keeps restarting itself endlessly. The loop begins every time it ends. This becomes especially haunting when observing human civilization. History repeats emotionally even when details change. Fear, power, love, violence, hope, greed, meaning. Humanity cycles through the same psychological structures across centuries, wearing different technologies and symbols. People imagine themselves entirely modern, yet ancient emotional patterns still drive behavior beneath the surface. The loop survives through evolution itself, and maybe consciousness operates this way too. Every morning, identity reconstructs itself from memory again. Every day the self dissolves into sleep temporarily. Every thought arises, disappears, and returns through different forms endlessly. You are not one stable thing moving through time. You are an ongoing process, movement repeating itself continuously while appearing solid, like fire maintaining shape while its particles constantly change. Still, humans long desperately for finality. Final answers, final peace, final certainty. The ego wants completion because completion promises relief from endless becoming. But perhaps existence itself has no final stopping point, only transformation, one state becoming another endlessly. And maybe this explains why certain moments feel strangely eternal. Listening to waves, watching rain, hearing repeating music late at night. Something inside consciousness recognizes the rhythm of recurrence deeply, reality moving in patterns larger than individual identity. Birth becoming death, becoming birth again through endless transformation. Not necessarily literally, but structurally. The universe constantly rebuilding itself through cycles, and perhaps the most disturbing loop of all is thought itself. The mind searches endlessly for meaning, certainty, control, identity, Yet every answer eventually creates new questions again. Consciousness loops back toward mystery, no matter how far understanding progresses. Science discovers deeper uncertainty. Philosophy discovers deeper paradox. The self searches for itself endlessly, without final completion. The loop survives inside awareness itself. Still, there may be something strangely beautiful about this, because loops also create continuity. Music depends on repetition. Seasons depend on cycles. Love survives through recurring moments shared over time. Even memory itself loops the past into the present continuously, allowing identity to exist at all. Without recurrence, existence might feel empty, disconnected, meaningless. The loop is not only prison, it is also rhythm, and perhaps freedom is not escaping every loop completely, but becoming conscious enough to choose which loops deserve continuation. Late at night, this realization becomes hauntingly clear. You notice how often life repeats itself while pretending to move forward, how endings quietly contain beginnings already forming underneath them, how consciousness keeps rebuilding itself every moment from patterns older than memory. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: nothing truly ends in the clean way the mind wants. Reality only changes shape, then returns again through another form, another thought, another self, another beginning hiding inside what once looked like the end. Reality that depends on attention to exist. Most people believe reality exists independently from attention. The world continues whether you notice it or not. Cities remain standing while you sleep. Stars burn without observation. Entire lives unfold beyond your awareness every second. And physically, this is true. But psychologically, reality behaves very differently. Because for human consciousness, what is not noticed often barely exists at all. Attention determines experience, and once you truly understand this, existence itself begins feeling strangely fragile. Think about how much of your life disappears simply because you stop paying attention to it. A sound fades into the background after repeating long enough. A relationship slowly weakens when attention vanishes from it. Beauty becomes invisible through familiarity. Even time itself feels faster when awareness becomes distracted. The mind does not experience all of reality equally. It experiences only what attention illuminates, and suddenly an impossible thought appears. For conscious experience, attention may function like existence itself. Whatever receives attention becomes psychologically real. Whatever loses attention slowly dissolves from lived reality. At first, this seems obvious. Of course, attention matters, but the deeper you examine it, the stranger it becomes. Fear grows through attention. The more the mind focuses on danger, the larger danger feels emotionally. Thoughts repeated continuously become convincing, regardless of whether they are objectively true. A single insecurity can dominate consciousness entirely, simply because awareness keeps feeding it attention. The same thing happens with suffering. Pain intensifies when the mind loops around it endlessly. Anxiety grows stronger through constant mental rehearsal. Emotional wounds deepen when attention repeatedly returns to them without release. Attention acts like psychological energy. Whatever consciousness repeatedly touches becomes stronger internally. But the opposite is also true. Love deepens through attention. Meaning deepens through attention. Beauty becomes visible through attention. A quiet moment transforms completely when fully noticed. The world most people ignore suddenly feels alive again. Rain against windows, breathing, distant nighttime sounds. Tiny details consciousness usually filters out. Attention changes the richness of existence itself. And perhaps this explains why modern life feels emotionally fragmented for so many people. Attention is constantly divided, pulled endlessly between screens, notifications, fears, comparisons, noise and distraction. Consciousness rarely rests fully anywhere long enough to experience depth. The mind skims across reality without entering it deeply, and gradually life starts feeling thinner, faster, less real. Because reality without sustained attention becomes emotionally shallow. This creates one of the deepest paradoxes of human existence. People search desperately for meaning while continuously giving attention to things draining meaning away. Endless stimulation weakens presence. Presence weakens connection to experience. And without presence, reality begins feeling distant even while physically surrounding you. Perhaps this is why loneliness can exist even in crowded rooms. Attention is elsewhere, disconnected. The body remains present while consciousness lives inside thought, memory, anticipation, or distraction. Reality fades behind internal noise, and maybe this is why certain moments feel almost sacred. Watching snowfall silently, listening to someone completely without preparing responses internally, looking at the sky long enough for thought to slow down. During those moments, attention becomes unified. Consciousness stops scattering itself temporarily. Reality suddenly feels vivid again, not because the world changed, but because awareness finally arrived fully inside it. Still, attention remains unstable. The mind constantly gravitates toward what feels emotionally urgent. Fear captures attention automatically because survival systems prioritize threat. Social comparison captures attention because identity depends partly on external validation. Desire captures attention because the brain seeks reward continuously. Modern systems understand this deeply. Entire industries compete aggressively for human attention because attention shapes perception, emotion, belief, and behavior. What people repeatedly consume becomes part of psychological reality over time. The mind becomes what it repeatedly notices, and perhaps that is the most disturbing part of all. Attention does not merely reveal reality, it partly constructs lived reality internally. Two people can inhabit the same world while experiencing completely different psychological universes depending on what receives their awareness consistently. One notices beauty, another notices danger. One notices connection, another notices emptiness. Reality organizes itself differently around different patterns of attention, not because objective existence disappears, but because conscious experience depends heavily on selective awareness. And maybe identity itself forms this way too. The self becomes partly shaped by whatever consciousness repeatedly focuses upon over years. A person constantly attending to failure begins feeling like failure itself. Someone repeatedly attending to gratitude begins experiencing life differently emotionally. Attention slowly sculpts the architecture of the mind. This becomes especially strange when thinking about memory. Memories survive through attention. Moments revisited repeatedly remain emotionally alive. Experiences ignored gradually disappear into unconsciousness. The past continues existing psychologically only through awareness returning to it again and again. Even identity depends on this process. The story of who you are survives because the mind continuously revisits certain memories, emotions and narratives while ignoring others. The self is partly maintained through repeated attention, and perhaps this is why meditation feels transformative for many people. Not because it magically changes reality, but because it changes the structure of attention itself. For brief moments, awareness stops being dragged automatically by fear, desire, memory, and distraction. Consciousness becomes quieter, clearer, more direct. Reality begins feeling immediate again, rather than filtered constantly through compulsive thought. Still, the mind always returns to movement eventually. Attention shifts again. The world reforms psychologically around whatever consciousness begins feeding once more. And perhaps that is unavoidable. Human awareness was never designed to remain perfectly still. But late at night, when existence grows quiet enough, another realization sometimes appears. You notice how much of life passed unnoticed. How many beautiful moments disappeared because attention was elsewhere. How many fears became powerful only because consciousness fed them endlessly. How many parts of reality remained invisible simply because you never fully looked. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: reality may not depend on attention to exist physically, but your experience of reality becomes shaped almost entirely by whatever your awareness chooses to keep alive inside it. Mind that cannot escape its own perspective. Every human being experiences reality from the center of themselves. No matter how deeply you empathize with others, no matter how much knowledge you gather, every experience still arrives through your own consciousness first. You see through your eyes, feel through your nervous system, think through your memories. Even your understanding of other people exists as interpretation happening inside your own mind. And perhaps this is the strangest prison consciousness inhabits. The mind can imagine other perspectives, but it can never fully escape its own. At first, this seems obvious. Of course you experience life from your own point of view, but the deeper you examine this fact, the more unsettling it becomes, because you have never truly experienced reality objectively, not once. Everything you know about existence arrives filtered through perception, language, biology, memory, emotion, attention, and interpretation. You do not see reality directly. You see your mind's version of reality. And the mind has no way to fully step outside itself to compare its version against absolute truth. A fish born underwater may not understand water because water surrounds every experience it has ever known. Likewise, consciousness cannot easily recognize the limits of perspective because perspective shapes every possible observation already. This creates one of the deepest paradoxes of human existence. The mind searches endlessly for objective truth, using tools trapped inside subjectivity. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than disagreement. Two people can witness the same event and leave with entirely different realities afterward. Different meanings, different emotional truths, different memories. Each perspective feels internally real, because each consciousness organizes experience differently, and neither mind can fully leave itself behind long enough to see reality from nowhere at all. This becomes especially strange when thinking about identity. You have an image of yourself inside your mind, but no one else experiences you exactly the way you experience yourself internally. Others know only fragments filtered through behavior, language, expression, and their own interpretation. Likewise, you never truly know another person's inner world directly. You know your experience of them, not consciousness itself from inside their perspective. This means every human relationship contains invisible distance, no matter how close people become. Even love cannot fully merge perspectives completely. Consciousness remains partially isolated inside itself, and perhaps that is why loneliness feels existential sometimes, rather than merely social. The self longs to be fully understood, yet complete understanding between minds may be impossible structurally. Language transfers approximation, not direct experience. You can describe grief endlessly, but no one feels your exact grief completely. You can explain fear, beauty, longing, memory, but the actual internal texture of experience remains private. Each mind lives inside its own universe of perception, and yet humans constantly forget this. People assume others see the world the way they do. They mistake personal perspective for objective reality automatically. This creates conflict everywhere. Politics, religion, morality, relationships, entire civilizations collide because consciousness struggles to recognize its own limitations clearly. The ego wants certainty that its perspective is correct, because uncertainty feels psychologically threatening. But reality may be far larger than any single perspective can fully contain, and perhaps this becomes most unsettling when examining the self itself. Can you ever truly know who you are objectively? Every attempt at self-understanding still happens from inside the same perspective being analyzed. The mind interprets itself through its own biases, fears, desires, blind spots, and emotional conditioning. The observer cannot fully separate from the observed, like trying to bite your own teeth or seeing your eyes directly without reflection. Consciousness remains trapped inside the machinery, performing the observation. Still, humans continue searching for truth. Philosophy, science, art, meditation, conversation, all attempts to expand perspective beyond ordinary limitation. And perhaps these pursuits matter not because they provide perfect objectivity, but because they reveal how incomplete every perspective already is. Humility begins where certainty weakens. The realization that your version of reality is not reality itself, only one window into something infinitely larger. This realization can feel frightening initially, because the ego depends heavily on stable interpretation. If perspective is limited, then certainty becomes fragile too. But strangely, recognizing limitation can also create compassion. Once you realize your own mind cannot fully escape itself, you begin understanding why others struggle too, why misunderstandings happen, why fear distorts perception, why humans cling to beliefs emotionally. Everyone is navigating existence through incomplete perspective, temporary minds trying to understand reality from inside themselves. And perhaps this is why awe feels so powerful psychologically. Standing beneath stars, looking across oceans, encountering profound beauty or mystery. During those moments, the ego briefly senses how small its perspective truly is compared to existence itself. The mind stops pretending complete understanding is possible, and instead, wonder appears. Still, the paradox remains unavoidable. No matter how deeply you understand the limits of perspective, you still cannot fully step outside perspective itself. Every realization still occurs from somewhere. Every insight still belongs to consciousness experiencing itself internally. You cannot experience reality from nowhere, only from here, from this fragile center called you. And perhaps this is why life feels simultaneously intimate and mysterious. Everything you will ever know exists inside consciousness, yet consciousness itself cannot fully understand the reality containing it. Late at night, this realization becomes haunting. You suddenly feel the strange isolation of awareness itself, the fact that every memory, fear, dream, and moment of existence has unfolded entirely inside one perspective you can never fully leave behind. And perhaps the final impossible thought is this: the mind spends its entire existence trying to understand reality objectively, while never being able to escape the invisible lens through which reality is always being seen. And now, after traveling through all these impossible thoughts, something may feel different. Not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, as if reality itself has become slightly less solid than it was before. Because tonight was never really about finding answers. It was about standing face to face with the strange limits of consciousness itself. A mind that cannot fully prove reality. A self built from memory, attention, fear, and borrowed ideas. Thoughts pretending to be identity. Certainty built upon uncertainty. Awareness searching endlessly for itself while never fully escaping its own perspective. The deeper you look, the stranger existence becomes. And yet, perhaps there is something beautiful hidden inside that uncertainty too. Because even if reality cannot be fully explained, you still experienced it. You still felt wonder. You still loved. Still questioned, still existed for a brief moment inside an infinite universe capable of becoming aware of itself through you. Maybe that is enough. Maybe consciousness was never meant to solve every paradox completely. Maybe it was only meant to witness them, to sit quietly beneath the stars, aware for a little while, before returning once again to silence. And perhaps the most impossible thought of all is that despite all the uncertainty surrounding existence, this moment still felt real to you. The thoughts, the questions, the strange feeling of awareness listening to itself in the dark. For now, let the mind rest. Let the questions drift slowly away. and allow yourself to disappear gently into the silence that was waiting beneath every thought all along.